We had round 4 of the 2024 Candidates Chess Tournament today in Toronto, Canada, and we're going to be covering the games of that. Um, we'll go to the website real quick so that you guys can get a look at that. Okay, as you can see here, everything's listed on the website. You guys can check that out for yourself. But Jan Nepomniachtchi with 3 points is now leading the tournament after today. He won with the white pieces against Vidit. We'll go over that game as well. Gukesh Caruana are tied for second, just a half a point behind with 2.5. And then there's 5 players with 1.5. And they're kind of distanced themselves now. Already 1.5 points behind the leader, Jan Nepomniachtchi. Jan has played a wonderful game today. That's will be the last game we look at because that's the game of the day. And in fact, in my opinion, is the game of the tournament so far up to this point. The first game we're going to take a look at is Nakamura Pragnananda. Um, Not a lot of fireworks in this game. It started off with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. This is the Spanish opening that we've seen quite a few times now in this tournament. a6, bishop a4, knight f6 is the Berlin. Um, well, actually, it's not the Berlin because a6 has been played, but it transposes into a sideline of the Berlin. So, okay, Nakamura's already seen this because Vidit played it. Bishop c5, and then this game he castles. b5 was played. Bishop drops back to b3 and h6. Um, h6 is kind of an unusual move. Um, I don't know if there was anything better here for white, but Nakamura chose the response a4. He's threatening to take on b5 because the rook on a8 is hanging. So black simply moves the rook to b8. This protects the b5 pawn if there's any exchange on b5 and gets the rook off of the pin. Nakamura plays the move bishop e3, which I thought was kind of just, hit it in the. I don't want to say like, he was playing for a draw and just doesn't care about the tournament anymore. But I mean, when you play a move like bishop to e3 and you just start looking for exchanges, it's certainly. But to be fair, I mean, this bishop on b3 is much more active than the bishop on c8, so there's still something slightly in the position after an exchange of dark square bishops, but not much. I thought that if there was any, if he wanted to try, even though this move's never been played, if he wanted to try for something in this particular position, that knight takes e5 is actually very interesting here instead of bishop to e3. So, for instance, if knight takes e5, I mean, what else? We're attacking f7, and we just took a pawn. So you almost have to take back. White plays d4, which is what's called a center fork trick. You sacrifice a piece, but you get it back immediately. Center fork trick. Bishop takes d4, queen takes d4, d6, and I thought, hey, this is better than exchanging a dark square bishop, right? Almost has to be. So in this position, maybe white could play. He has space advantage f4. the knight pretty much has to go back to c6, and then queen to d3 is the first move that I had looked at. But then I thought to myself on my own thoughts, because the computer kept recommending queen d3, I thought, what about queen to c3? Because queen to c3 attacks the knight on c6 again. He was attacking our queen, so we move away and attack the undefended piece. I mean, just made a lot of sense to me. And also, queen c3 stops knight a5, obviously. So, maybe black wanted to play knight a5 and harass this bishop. And then I went a little bit further. I've started looking at some lines, and I didn't feel like that black had anything better than knight to e7. So when I see this, I started thinking, man, white may have something in this position. Because if he doesn't have anything better than to play his knight to e7, this does look like something for white, right? I mean, for instance, he can't just play bishop b7 because then there's ab5, ab5, e5, knight e4, queen e3. And we're attacking the knight on e4. And now that the A line's been opened up, he doesn't have this move knight to a5, which would have been kind of maybe a little bit of a savior. The bishop on b7 would have protected the knight on e4, and he would have attacked the light square bishop. But the rook on a1 now defends the a5 square, and we're attacking this. And if the knight moves, we have e takes d6 with a discovered check. So this looked pretty difficult for black, to be honest. If he plays knight e7, which seemingly is the only move to protect the knight, then we can go forward with f5, and it looked like white had a nice attack here. My analysis went like, say, d takes e5, knight c3, very nice move. If he wants to exchange pieces, fine. We'll take with the, couldn't decide whether I'd take with a pawn or the queen. I'd have to analyze that in great detail, but certainly looks pretty compelling since we'd have control of c5 square and potentially put the bishop on the a3 f8 diagonal. So that looked interesting to me. But yeah, okay, so knight takes e5 was definitely something interesting, to say the least. Going back to queen c3, if he would have played knight e7, okay, I pretty much stopped my analysis here after knight e7, I believe, because it just felt like the white had a better position. Again, so we'll go back to the game. The game was bishop e3. Nakamura, or Pragnananda, took the bishop. F takes e3. So, okay, he has half open file. The pawn going to e3 is now, a center pawn. So maybe Nakamura thought that he had a little something here, but the way that Pragg plays it, b5, queen e1, and maybe he was thinking about bringing the queen to g3 or h4. Most likely bringing the queen to g3, and then maybe the knight could. But the queen coming to e1, there's always this threat of maybe pushing the knight to h4 and f5 to put pressure on these weak and dark squares. But without a dark square bishop, it's really hard to achieve anything. Castle h3 played. Usually, when you have to play moves like h3, it just quashes your initiative to a degree. It allowed for knight e7, knight c3, and bishop e6, and black's just fine in this position, I believe. There's nothing here. The game continued knight d2, queen d7, knight e2, and rook a8, bishop takes e6, pawn takes, rook takes, knight g3. They're just moving pieces around at this point. So there's not much going on in this position. They repeated the position 3 times with ridiculous queen b1, rook a2, and that was that. So we'll no longer. We'll just get that one out of the way. I'm very unimpressed with Nakamura the last few rounds. I mean, ever since he lost the game with the white pieces, it's just kind of his games have been really lackluster. But for whatever for whatever that is. I mean, it is what it is, right? As he always says. Um, the next game we're going to take a look at is Abasoft against Ferocia. Another game that was kind of dry. D4 knight f6, c4 e6 knight c3, bishop to b4. We finally get an Imzo Indian defense. There was some bluffing going on in the first 3 rounds. It could have been played several times, but everybody avoided it, and now we finally get one. Um, Abasoft plays queen c2, which is the classical variation, also known as the Capablanca variation. He was probably like one of the first people to play queen c2. There's a lot of different options for white here. As his fourth move, he could play e3, and after castle knight g2, this leads to what's known as the Rubinstein variation. On the fourth move, a3 is the same-ish variation, and then you have knight f3, and you have several other lines as well. Like white can even play f3 and e4 in this position, but there's so much theory here. So the move we're going to take a look at played in the game is queen c2. Black plays the move d6. Now his idea is that he eventually wants to achieve the move e5 at some point in the middle game so that he can develop his bishop. White plays e3, castle, bishop to d3. So he's probably going for a quick e4. He wants to play e4, e5 to make this knight move, and then the bishop and the queen, obviously lined up on h7, would win a pawn. So Ferocia knew that he needed to react quickly to get his share of the center. He plays the move c5. And in this position, the main move is knight g to e2 for white. This move, knight g2, has been played, a zillion times. Knight c6 castle. White has pretty good position, but once I saw the move c5 or d takes c5, I knew immediately that Abasoft just didn't want to play, interesting chess, because after bishop c5, knight f3, d5, black literally equalizes with no problem at all. And this game also kind of uneventful, which is not a surprise considering that all of Abasoft's games have been pretty much uneventful. Castle dc4, bishop c4, knight bd7. You can see the pawn structure is completely symmetrical. So these types of positions are usually pretty dry. It's still chess, right? But it's just not interesting. b3, a6. Both sides trying to develop their pieces. The bishop on c8 is a tough one to develop, so he plays b5. He needs to get it out on the diagonal. White's just going for piece trades, literally, like not trying to create any kind of tension or build up in the position. Bishop to b7. He does get the bishop pair. I mean, but in this position, you can see that there's he's immediately given up the bishop pair. But the bishop on d3 is being attacked, and he's choosing pretty much the most boring lines. So bishop b3 is not a sacrifice per se because the knight on c5 is hanging, but black simply takes on b3, queen b3, ab5, and rook d1. Obviously, white could not take the pawn on at b5 immediately because bishop to a6 would have skewered the queen and the rook here. So after rook d1, queen c7 was a nice touch. Again, the pawn's not really. It's really too risky to take this pawn here because you potentially could get yourself into a lot of trouble. What was the line I looked at? I believe, yeah. What happens here is he plays rook a5, and then after bishop takes f3, you may have some problems with your king side, right? So the pawn's kind of untouchable. Queen to c5 now was played by Ferocia, or I'm sorry, bishop to b2 first for white, developing the bishop, and then queen c5, which protects the pawn, but also plans on bringing the queen to the king's side, where coupled with this light square bishop, he can try to dominate the white square. So at this point, Abbasov just clearly wanted to make peace and plays the move bishop f6, gf6, rook a c1, and then queen f5 comes, and there's black has a little bit of an initiative now because he wants to come here, right? Play bishop takes f3 and attack the light squares. That's his strength with the light square bishop. So now white plays the move knight d4, which attacks the pawn and the queen. Queen g5 was played. This threatens checkmate. There's no time to take this pawn on b5. Knight to c6 was played. This blocks the diagonal. And also, if black would play rook c8 to build up on this knight, there would be knight e7 check, which is an unpleasant fork. So instead, black attacks the knight by playing rook a6. And then white hits the queen with h4, giving up a pawn. He takes it. So it's a trade-off of the h4 pawn for the pawn on b5, queen b5, rook a2. And black is attacking f2, so you definitely don't want to grab this bishop because you're going to get mated here on g2. So you first had to play g3 to protect the f2 square, and then bishop takes c6 intermezzo, queen takes, and then the queen moves away. And this game went on to just be a pretty eventless, boring draw. We're not going to bother too much with this. I'm sorry, guys, but I'm a little bit carried away by these games. Black was a pawn up, but it's well known that in queen endings, the big thing for black here, to be fair, was just to, or for white, I'm sorry, was you can see that the king is exposed, so he's looking for a perpetual check. So black's going to defend against that for a short period of time, but he's just going to constantly go places where he's harassing the king. f5, queen d8, and eventually black's going to make so many pawn moves that it's going to be like literally impossible for him to hide behind his pawns. Queen e8, king h6, king g2, f4, gf4, queen f4, queen h8, king g5, queen d8, king g4, queen b7, yada yada yada, queen b3, aiming to go to g8 and start checking yet again. e4, queen c3, queen g4, king h2, king h4, queen f6, queen g5, queen d6. And as you can see here, black can't make much progress because of his exposed king. And so king g4 was played, queen d1, king f4, queen d2. Finally, they agreed to a draw. There was nothing left to do. Now, in Firouzja's defense, he did everything he could to try to stir up some trouble, but white just played passively and was aiming for a draw the whole time, and eventually held the draw. So kind of an uneventful game there. Let's get to the most interesting games of the day. Fabiano Caruana playing the white pieces. This is his third white pieces, if I'm not mistaken, in 4 rounds. A little bit strange that he gets to... Yeah. A little bit strange that he's playing 3 white pieces in 4 rounds, but I guess at the end of the day, it's going to even itself out, obviously, because they play a round robin, so which means you play each player with black and white twice or once with each color, and you play each player with each color in the tournament. That's kind of what a round robin is. So we had e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and Mr. Italian American Fabiano plays bishop to c4, which is none other than the Italian game. It's the first one we've had in this tournament. Bishop c5 is played, castle, knight f6, d3, d6, c3, a6, a4. Okay, so here at this point, black, you may be wondering, well, why is black making the move a6? Well, he wants to drop this bishop back to a7 and preserve it on this diagonal. White plays a4 and he drops it back immediately, rather than, like, say, if he castles, then, it usually ends up leading to the same position. But so the bishop can come back here. There could be, a threat, for instance, of b5, because after a b5, black plays a b5, hitting the bishop, and if you move the bishop to just say like b3, then you get hit with this bishop takes f2 tactic, rook takes f2, rook takes a1, winning material. So you always have to be, there's reasons behind your opponent's move, especially when you're playing a really good opponent. So you have to be always asking yourself, what are they trying to do? So bishop a7 played, h3, castle, knight bd2, rook e8. The black wants to try to break with the d5 move, so he's given protection to the e5 square. b4 was played, bishop e6. And also, another point behind rook e8 was to play this move, bishop e6. If white captures on e6, you can take with the rook rather than the pawn. Your position's really not set up to take with the pawn. So he wanted to take with the rook, and he did take with the rook. Queen to c2, rook e8. The rook didn't really belong on e6, so he goes back to e8. Rook e1's played, protecting e4, maybe hinting at an eventual d4 break, although that's pretty hard to realize. Black has good control over that square. h6, knight to f1, and d5. Breaking in the center. And in this position, Fabiano plays a novelty, knight to g3. Knight to e3 had been seen before, and that was a game between Vachier Lagrave, a blitz game actually between Vachier Lagrave and Kramnik, blitz tournament in Paris 2018. Not sure if that was played online or not, but yeah, that game went bishop e3, queen d7, b5, take, knight e7, and then there was knight e5, queen b5, c4. In this position, d takes c4 was played by Kramnik, but it's pretty known that queen b4 is a little bit better. For instance, after cd5, there's this move, knight e takes d5. And the point here is that you can get by with doing this because the rook's attacking this knight. So yeah, this was an interesting move. Queen b4. Not sure how much value it is. Like cd5, knight ed5, knight c4, knight takes, and then queen to d4 is the point. You're just going to build up on here, so these pawns are not hanging, because after rook a4, you can play queen e5, protecting the pawn on c7, and black has a decent game. So in this game, Fabiano plays this novelty, knight to g3, and I thought this was very interesting, because now what happens is, after b5, which I thought was a dubious move, Fabiano goes knight to f5, which is, ideal square. Notice in the Kramnik game that he exchanged his bishop off for this knight because he didn't want it going here. But from g3, he wasn't able to. In this current game, he wasn't able to exchange it off. The knight hops into f5. Usually when you have this weakness of this move h6 and this bishop still on the board, and there's a knight on f5, you have to be really careful about these two squares particularly. And we're going to see that in a minute. D takes e4, d takes e4, and black plays knight e7. He knew that this knight on f5 had to go. And in this position, Fabiano played knight takes e5, but after knight takes f5, e takes f5, c5, it was pretty clear that this extra pawn on f5 wasn't such a big deal. White didn't really have a lot. He pressed a little bit, but we're going to take a look at maybe another possibility that he had here. Instead of knight takes e5 in this position, I was looking at move knight takes g7, and it's very interesting. In fact, I'm always looking for these types of moves in these positions. You have to analyze them, even if the computer doesn't say it's any good. Like, so the computer didn't really help me with this because the computer doesn't really think that knight takes g7 is any good. But as you lead it manually, it starts to change its mind a little bit. So king takes g7. The idea is knight takes e5, and now the thing is we're threatening bishop takes h6 and forking the king and queen. So this is destructive, destroying the black king side. You always have to consider, and maybe Fabiano, to be fair, did consider this, but just didn't see a route to. So you're taking risk, right, when you do this because you're sacrificing a piece. But I'm not really sure how much of a risk that you would consider it because with an open king like this, you'd have to think that you would probably, at the very least, be getting a draw. It's not really that clear though. So I didn't. The problem with for black in this position is he doesn't really have a good way to stop white's intentions. This is the thing, and the computer recommends, like, for instance, queen to c8 in this position. But like, say if white plays bishop b2, queen e6, and this is white's intention obviously was to maybe play queen b3, which attacked f7 square. So you always had to be cautious of that, or also to play the move c4, opening the bishop up on the king. So we play c4 in this position anyway. B takes c4, knight to g4, and the knight's pinned, threatening to win the piece. So he has to play knight e to g8 to protect, and then rook a to d1. And this is probably the move that, well, I wouldn't say that a lot of GMs would miss this move, um, but they may not see kind of the idea behind it. The knight on f6 is pinned, so you're always looking for ways to build on that. So the move rook a to d1, as you can see from the arrows, is threatening to lift to d5 and then to f5 and put more pressure on f6. And one idea here would be for black would be to get the king out of the pin, so that if the rook comes to d5, you can take it, right? Makes sense. And then knight takes f6, knight takes f6, queen to c3. And so the idea here is the pressure on the dark squares. And this is not easy to defend at all. And I'll give a couple examples here. Computers suggest a move like rook a to b8. But for instance, if you go king e7, there's rook d5, threatening rook e5. And you can't take this rook because, whoops, why does it keep doing that to me? All right, rook d5. You can't take this rook, obviously, because of the pinning the queen to the king, and white's going to have a winning material advantage. So after rook d5, it's pretty much winning, but let's say black plays knight d7. This defends the e5 square. Then white plays rook e to d1, attacking the knight on d7. He has to defend that knight, and then we play this move bishop to a3. As you can see, if the king's getting ready to get hit with b5, and then the bishop's attacking it, and then if the king goes to the back rank, we have the queen coming down to h8. I mean, this is just very, very dangerous. These are all computer defensive moves too, by the way, for black. So this isn't, I'm not just playing any old move. So c6 here, b5, c5, trying to keep it closed, queen to d2, and now just literally threatening to ambush him because we're, this bishop is passive now. This bishop's aiming down here. We're thinking about playing rook to d6 and then gobbling up this pawn. The king is just completely filleted here. Black's passive, and it's just a matter of time. King e8, bishop to b2, controlling the f6 square so that he literally can't move any of his pieces. ab5, ab5, bishop to b6, and then rook d6, bang, queen e7, queen h6, game's over. So it's I know it's a lot, but these are the types of things that win you chess games. And then taking on g7 was maybe a little bit too much to ask, and the players this early in the tournament don't want to take those types of risks. But I would bet that Caruana probably looked at it. He just didn't see a conclusion. It's a bit much to ask somebody to analyze all of that. So not seeing the conclusion, you can certainly understand why he didn't go for it. In the later rounds, if he needed a point and was behind, he may go for something like this. So, it's early in the tournament. Players that are, if you're in second place, it's not, you don't want to throw yourself off of a cliff, right? So it's certainly understandable. So knight takes e5 was played in the game. Knight takes f5 is pretty much forced. E takes f5, and then the move c5 was played. There was another possibility. Black, some of the commentators, like the Chess Dojo commentators, recommended this engine move, knight d5, and uh, what the move that I had looked at. So knight d5 is the engine's best move, and they were supposedly analyzing without engines, but I wasn't convinced they were analyzing without engines. They just didn't want the chat room to analyze with engines and be making their job any harder. That's what I feel like, and I just left the chat, so I won't go back into the chess or the chess dojo chat because it kind of pissed me off because I kept watching the things that and they were quickly seeing these moves, and I was like, whoa, wow, like, now they're good players, but like, okay, nobody sees this stuff like really fast, so it was pretty obvious that they were checking out the engine, but just didn't want the chat to. So I thought that it was going to be, like, so I'm going to quit raving and ranting about that, but it kind of pissed me off. With that being said, um, the move that I had looked at, which is not an engine move, is queen d5. So, okay, you're attacking the knight twice. So, I thought, well, okay, if this knight comes back to, like, say, f3, this line here looked pretty good. I thought rook takes e1, knight e4, you're attacking f2. And, playing a move like bishop to e3 would be quite a concession because f5 is hanging. And this is a very good post for the knight. And so, I thought that this was interesting. And although white can, to be fair, white can take here, and that's quite annoying as you can't recapture because the queen's defending the knight, and this is a pin. So, oh, I'm sorry, you can actually take back. So AB5, you can just take back because rook takes, queen takes, and it's still defending E4. So the thing is that, like, they immediately, so I saw that one of the GMs in the chess dojo said, well, the guy, after he looked at my variation for like 30 seconds, he said, oh, well, the guy wouldn't play knight f3. Well, what would he play? I guess he would play bishop to f4, right? Well, let's take a look at what the computer recommends. And these guys were supposedly not using the engine. There you go. Bishop to f4. I guess it was a little much to ask somebody to see c4, but okay, so bishop to f4 is the second line. As you can see, knight f3 is dubious because black actually gets a slight advantage, as I had analyzed. So the move c4 nobody supposedly saw, but bishop f4 they did see. And, here black, after I had recommended, okay, so what happens after c5? Because, okay, this is still interesting. If the rook comes to d1, the queen comes here. But the point is clear that black will gain a tempo by attacking this bishop on f4. So, okay, so this is just maybe a slight advantage for white, but it's still interesting piece placement, in my opinion, because now the queen has a nice square where it kind of defends all the queen side pawns, and white can't win a pawn on the queen side. But the rook can also come to c8, and we could threaten this queen on c2. So I thought that the black pieces were pretty well placed here, and yeah, I mean, you'd have to play like a machine to find anything advantageous for white there. Shoot, why does it keep resorting back to that line? Okay, so in this position, bishop after c5 was played by black, white plays bishop to f4, and then he's wanting to play knight c6, obviously, but before bishop to f4, the rook on e1 was hanging. But now the rook is protected, so he's wanting to go into c6. So black could play b takes a4, knight c6, queen d7, rook e8, rook e8, knight a7. And now intermezzo moves c takes b4, which was very important move, because if he would have captured immediately on a7, there was this pin with bishop to e3, which is quite unpleasant. And black here would have to take a little bit of a risk to stay with a balanced position. As you can see here from the engine, he'd have to actually give up an exchange and play this position with queen and knight. Then it's important to know that, like, after queen e3 here, you don't just auto move your king. King h1 would have led to knight e4, and that would be an immediate draw. But white, trying to play for something here, would play queen f2. But after queen b3, it's unclear that white can really make any progress, because if you move the queen away, this knight can come into e4 potentially, and it would be hard for white to avoid um, the draw anyway. So that's a very unclear position. But so in the game, he played c takes b4 because this knight can't get out anyway. Its squares are all taken that it could retreat to. So after cb4, queen to d4, nice little touch. This is hitting two pieces, in fact. So he decides that he wants to keep the bishop by defending it with a queen. He also needed to defend the rook. So actually, queen to d4 was hitting three pieces. Octopus queen, as they would say. Queen to c1 defends two of the pieces. And then queen a7, rook a4, queen to b7, queen d2, keeping everything tidied up. Knight d5, attacking the bishop. Bishop drops back. f6, bishop to d6, defends the pawn on b4 so that maybe the rook can move. And one line that I took a look at instead of bishop d6 was queen a2, which pins the knight to the queen and attacks the pawn on a6. But the idea is that after king h6, rook a6, that he can play knight b4 and fork the queen and rook. So never think that you're looking too far ahead and that you're outsmarting your opponent, because they may be outsmarting you, and that's what would have happened here. Because after rook a7, queen e4, black is actually just better, or at the very least just has no problems. But I would hate to play this position with this kind of passive bishop and this active knight. Personally, I don't. He's going to get the pawn back on f5, so he's not even going to be a pawn down. And then the queen and knight are such a tricky combination, and the computer doesn't appreciate that. As you can see, it says the position is equal, but I definitely wouldn't want to play white in this position. So here, bishop d6 was played, Queen c6 attacking the rook on a4. Rook to a5 attacking the knight on d5. So they just kept making basically. So here now we get some trade-offs. Rook e1 pretty much forced to trade everything off. And this game petered out into a draw, obviously. It was going to be impossible for white to make progress. Ended up with just a perpetual check. Black even got the pawn. Not much that could be done. Just your queen always has to defend your king, and there's no way to push the pawns effectively. So that game ended up a draw, but a hard-fought game. And now the game of the round, and the most eventful game between Jan Nepomniachtchi, who is the current leader, and Vidit. And both of these guys played an amazing game. They both took risk. They both took chances. Let's see how it played out. E4, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, knight f6. We have the Berlin variation of the Ruy Lopez. Castle, knight e4, d4. This is the main line. As you can see here in the variations, there's other tries that white's made, but nothing really worth noting. In the game, black plays knight d6, bishop c6, d takes c6, d takes e5, knight f5, queen d8, king d8. And we have what's called the Berlin endgame. So what is meant by this is that the reason why it's called the Berlin is because, if I'm not mistaken, was that the... I actually, now that I'm second guessing myself, I actually want to look it up while I'm streaming because I can't. So Kasparov and Kramnik played this in their World Championship match in at least 3 games, maybe 4. And you'll see that here in one moment. As soon as I let it finish loading and I click on ELO for white, you'll see Kasparov's name pop up here at the top because he was at one point rated like 2850 FIDE. Magnus Carlsen is just slightly under that at the moment at 2839. Actually, I don't know what that was Magnus's rating when he played a Caro here. I don't know what Magnus Carlsen's current classical rating is. Okay, this thing's like literally stalling. I don't know if I can break it out of that without losing chess space. Let's hope that we can. All right, so I think it's finished. Yeah, you see Kasparov here at 2849. What I'm wondering is, okay, so this was Chorus 2001. Okay, that World Championship match was played in London. So the name Berlin, I didn't look into the history. Maybe if it's played again, I will look into that for next time. What is the history of it being called the Berlin? But okay, so what we have an end game here. Let's talk about the facets. The white has an undamaged pawn, kingside pawn majority. So he has 4 against 3 on the king side. Now, as you can see on the queen side, it's different because black has 4 pawns on the queen side, white has 3, but these are doubled pawns. So the opportunity to make a pass pawn on the queen side is much more difficult. And in fact, that plays out in this game. It was much more difficult for black to realize a pass pawn. And Jan Nepomniachtchi plays an awesome game. He even comes up with a novelty at one point. Let's take a look at it. Now, the compensation that black has for this is it's not really dangerous for the king to be in the center. So the king's already centralized to a degree. But there is still enough pieces on the board to where that the king can be in danger if he doesn't play correctly. And then black obviously has what's called the bishop pair, as we've seen in previous rounds in several games. So these are, it's kind of a trade off. White has space, white has a healthy pawn structure, black has the two bishops, black has a little bit better king position for if the rooks get traded off. So white in this position played knight d3, and black chose bishop to d7. Bishop d7 is the first step in the wrong direction, I thought, because the main move here is king e8, and for a reason. It's not clear exactly where you want the bishop yet, in my opinion. I think that the bishop really belongs on e6, and later on in the game it does go to e6. So I thought that bishop d7 was, kind of the first step in the wrong direction. Just my opinion. This has been played many times. White plays the move h3, which is the main move. The moves b3 and rook d1 in this position were the subject of Kasparov-Kramnik's World Championship match in 2001. And Judith Polgar and Samuel Sevian have played the move bishop to f4. h3 is the most common move these days. There's been a lot of moves tried here as black. In the game he plays h6, but b6, king c8, bishop e7, knight e7, they've all been tried. The main line is in fact h6. And then now Nepo goes down a very narrow path. There hasn't been a lot of games played here with the move g4, but it makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because you're literally forcing white's knight back, and then your bishop on e7, f8 can't develop. So the knight goes back to e2. And now it's not that big of a deal usually, because black wants to put the knight on g6 and then move the bishop anyway and control these weak and dark squares on the king side, right? So Nepomniachtchi plays a novelty here. So in this position, been seen a few times. White's usually played king g2, and a5 or b6 have been tried for black. The idea is pretty much to move the king over to the queen side, as you can see from the moves here. But in this position, black played what I thought to be kind of Nepomniachtchi played a novelty, knight h2. And his idea is he wants to get this kingside pawn majority rolling. And I looked at this and I saw this move and I was like, man, this makes a lot of sense, So now, with that being said, black did not play precisely and he was, in front of a new move. So he didn't, his preparation was thrown completely out the door. And these guys are good chess players, but a lot of times when their preparation this early is not there, they're going to make mistakes like everyone else. So these guys are usually very well prepared, but in this case, I don't think that it was. I do not think the move g5 in this position is good, because you're literally inviting white to play f4, and he's going to have pressure on f7, obviously, and then that made your move bishop to d7 look like a waste of time. So I think white won the opening battle here. Instead of playing g5, he should have played either knight d5, then bishop d2, knight c3, bishop c3, b5, and tried to get these pawns rolling to get this not only gain time against this bishop, but then maybe this bishop can get this diagonal, since white's created these weaknesses on this diagonal. And then like say f4, b4, and then c5, and the bishops can come out this way. Maybe even this pawn comes to c4, and if the bishops get on c6 and c5, I don't think that white has much in this position. So that was one way to go. Another way to go would have been to play the move c5 immediately, and then after f4, knight c6, rook f2, because the knight's coming here to attack c2, and he's also wanting to play bishop c6, in combination with this knight to put pressure on the weakened light squares. So then the move h5 and making sense out of this rook on h8 that it don't get stuck here. He wants to open a file, and he's putting pressure on this pawn on g4. And it seems to me like it'd be hard for white to claim any advantage here on either of these two moves. But the move g5 offered white to play f4 immediately, and then after gf4, because you just can't allow these pawns to continue to mobilize. He's also threatening the immediate f takes g anyway because of the bishop on c1. So g takes f4, bishop takes, and then the bishop had to go to e6 because he has to defend this weak pawn on f7. And now knight e4, and the bishop on e6 is now a target. So he had to play b6, but b6 was kind of dubious. The computer suggests knight to g6, hitting this bishop, and then maybe bishop d2 or bishop to e3. But this pawn on e5 would be loose as well. So knight to g6 was kind of a dynamic move, but Vidit plays b6, keeping the knight off of c5. White continues knight to f3, and now you see he's mobilizing his forces, c5. And now this very nice move, knight f6. Knight f6 is a real pain piece because it's keeping pieces off of e8 and g8, and pretty much the only way to get rid of it is to trade this dark square bishop, and that's not really what black wants to do. He didn't really want to trade his bishop pair off, right? So that's, and then if you ever take the knight on f6, it frees up after e takes f6. This is an advanced pawn, and it frees up the e5 square for white's pieces and opens the e file. So it's really a very good idea by Nepomniachtchi. Obviously not completely sound because, again, we looked at some variations where black is pretty much fine. But so king c8, king g2, he's just simply bringing the king up to protect the dark squares on the king side. King b7, king g3. And now black starts to go wrong. I mean, I don't know how much experience that Vidit has with the let me go back because I didn't look to see how much experience that Vidit has with the Berlin, but since he's over 2700, he should definitely be oh, I'm sorry, let me check black. As you can see, pretty much all the top players play. I think the highest that Vidit's been is around 2740-ish. So we have to keep going a little bit further. Geez, there's so many high-rated players that have played this opening. I have to do a database search. Since my computer runs slow when I do the searches, I can't do it right now. But I'm really interested in knowing whether Vidit has even played the Berlin defense before. And that was kind of my fear. I mean, he was playing this thing, and he is a very strong player, and I'm sure that he prepared it. He had looked at a lot of games, but I just wasn't getting the feeling from him like that he knew it well. Not saying that I know it better, but I just wasn't getting that feeling like that he was really in tune with the position. Now he ended up playing fairly well, but and creating some interesting idea, but he took a big risk at one point, and we're going to see that here in a moment. So after knight f6, king c8, king g2, king b7, king g3, a5. He plays this move a5, which I just thought was dubious. I just thought this was way too slow. Black has a lot of things going over here on the king side and is going to be creating threats. And I just thought that, but maybe he thought that his king side was in the best shape it could be. Um, I don't know. Yeah, he does have to get something going on the queen side. This is true. So anyway, very smart move by Nepomniachtchi, a3. Now the computer suggested a4. So I'm not saying that a3 was a very smart idea because actually the computer suggests a4 in this position. But a3 I thought was just so okay, there's a theory. I mean, because Fischer used to play the Roy Lopez exchange as white, and you would get the same pawn structure. You get the 4 against 3 on the king side, and he used to play, e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6, bishop takes, the knight on c6. You would have the same pawn structure as the Berlin, but it's well known that to stop this majority here, that if you put your pawns like this on c3, b2, and a3, these pawns can never by themselves break through when the pawns are in a V shape. So the move a4 could have, even though a computer move, and it's probably a good move if the computer is playing it right, but it would release the potential for black to, when you move your pawns towards black's majority, you are, he could potentially play c6 and b5 and create a passed pawn at some point. But the move a3 I thought was very wise. Black plays a4. Pretty much has to make any progress over here. And we'll see his idea behind a4 in a moment. White plays rook a to d1, taking control of the d file. Black cannot contest the d file at the moment. Knight to c6 played, keeping pressure here, trying to keep white's pieces honest. Then c3, and c3 is obviously aimed at keeping any pieces off of b4 or d4 at any point in time. But as you can see, he puts these pawns, like I said before, in a V shape. So he knows that black's going to move these pawns, and he doesn't want to react unless he absolutely has to. So bishop to e7 here, and then Nepomniachtchi goes for knight h4, and obviously wants to come to f5 and put pressure on h6. So black plays h5, which was a good move. And another Chestoja move. I mean, this stuff was really crazy, dude. I mean, like, most of their analysis, like, okay, so IMs and GMs are good chess players, right? But, like, let's be serious. Nobody commentating is just, like, perfect all the time. I mean, you're not perfect when you play chess, so you're not going to be perfect when you commentate either. But so if you're being perfect about your analysis all the time, 100% of the time, it's real simple. The equation equals you're using an engine to commentate, okay? Let's be serious about it. Let's not kid ourselves here. So b5, after h5, g5. So Vidit at this point is going all in. He's trying to play the most brilliant Berlin that's ever been played. And I just didn't think, when I seen this move, I thought, okay, I know what you're trying to do, but man, you're putting your cards all in when you play a move like rook to a5. Okay, so you're all in, man. I mean, you're saying that g6 for white isn't that big of a deal. It's really tough for me to accept this move, rook to a5. The computer didn't like it, but I'm not saying I don't like it because I didn't like it when I saw it. When I first saw it, I didn't even care. Half time, I don't even give a shit what the computer thinks about the position. But we in reality is the computer is usually right about things, right? So we have to consult with it before we make like videos like this, recaps and what have you. So there's nothing for the rook on d1 to do on the d file. He sees black's intention. Black wants to play c4. He wants to attack e5. So prophylactic move. He goes to e1. Now you see the rooks are in their best position. One is here and one is here. There was nothing to do on the d file. And there wasn't going to be anything to do on the d file anytime soon. So he puts the rook on e1, and now rook to b5, attacking the pawn on b2. And here, it was really difficult for white to defend this pawn. He has to back the bishop up. So when you start seeing pieces go backwards, it does to an extent justify what you're doing. However, this rook could very easily um, get caught out of the game. Like, it was not clear at all that this rook maneuvered, like, say, to b3 and then pushing b5, b4, that this was going to work. It wasn't obvious at all. But black does play rook b3, and he had an opportunity here instead to play the move c4, putting pressure. Now that the bishop has dropped back to c1, this pawn on e5, and I think somehow Vidit forgot. Like, his, I think rook b5, he was maybe, okay, so you can't play rook e2 because of bishop c4, skewering the rooks, but I thought that maybe he thought white was going to play rook f2 to defend this, and he didn't play c4 because these two pieces are still defending e5. I think that he forgot that once the bishop goes to c1, that this pawn on e5 is undefended. Because otherwise, it just doesn't make any sense why that he wouldn't include the move c4 to hit this pawn on e5. I mean, it should just be like natural. If you see that that pawn's undefended, to take a shot at it, let white defend it however he was going to do it, which the only move is knight f3. Um, there is g6 move, to be fair. What happens is after knight e5, the pawn goes to g7, and you have to see this complicated line: bishop to f6, rook takes f6, rook g8, bishop to h6, protecting the pawn g7. But even then, black has knight to d3 with counterplay. Again, the attacking the rook on e1, rook e2, knight takes b2, knight f3. It's not really clear that white's any better here. This passed pawn on g7, but you know, black's about ready to have some passed pawns of his own because these pawns should fall. So it's not really clear who's better here, to be honest. There was also the move knight f3 to defend e5 here, and I thought that after knight f3 that black had this move h4, which is not obvious to see at all why that's a good move. But basically, you're trying, you can't take with a knight because e5 would fall, and you obviously can't take with the king, so the king needs to move away, and then the rook coming to d8, and then and infiltrating the d3. Now that you don't have a light square bishop, he's attacking third rank. And then this knight on f3 can never move because h3 is weak. So this position here, after say rook e4, rook d3, rook f to e1, I thought was acceptable, play for black. But okay, so we're going back. Rook to b3, and white played g6. And this move extremely dangerous now. Black is walking on a thin line, and after f takes g6, knight takes g6, he makes yet another mistake with rook to d8, and then it's very, very difficult to hold the game at this point. He had one last opportunity here to play h4 check, and the idea is if knight takes h4, black has the move c4. Now this isn't easy to see, obviously, and obviously the rook is coming back to b5 to attack here. Um, One line could go like rook h1, knight takes e5, rook e5, bishop f6, rook e6, bishop h4. So that's one possible variation. And if white doesn't take on h4, then the rook can come back to d8. And then, if you don't take this pawn, it's kind of, I don't even know. There may be bishop takes and rook to here, but then this bishop's hanging. So it's kind of interesting. But in the game, he played rook to d8 after knight takes e7. Knight takes e7, white takes on h5, and now he has these strong passed pawns. And as you can see, black's a long way from achieving a passed pawn himself. Black had to play rook d3 to get one of the pawns back. After rook f3, king f3, bishop h3, he gets one of the pawns, but still left with this very strong pawn. The knight's ready to come here to g7, and the promotion square. The bishop's coming to g5. The rook's already behind the passed pawn. I mean, white has a ready-made recipe to promote this pawn, and he plays e6, b5, bishop g5, attacking the knight, so gaining time. Knight d5, e7, bishop d7, rook d1. So you may be asking yourself, well, why didn't he queen? Well, after bishop takes, rook takes, there's counterplay here. This pawn's hanging. These pawns are, there's a lot of counterplay here. So you don't want to give up the passed pawn like this and allow this kind of counterplay. So black plays the move bishop to e8. Or wait, I missed a few moves, didn't I? He played rook to d1, attacking here. The king had to come to c6 to defend both pieces. Then white moves his king to e4, threatening to take on d5. Black plays bishop to e8. And then white takes on d5. Now, Vidit, to be fair, Vidit at this point was in extreme time pressure. He had like less than 5 minutes to make the time control. King c6, king e4, bishop d8. Little bit of a mistake. I'm not sure if knight takes e7 would have held the game, but he definitely needed to try that. Take on b2 after knight f4, rook c2, knight to g6, threatening knight e5. White should still be winning, but it's definitely not as clear as in the game. He played bishop to e8, and this is a mistake because white can simply take the knight, and when you take the knight on h5, he plays the move bishop to c1, and you can see that this rook adventure a5, b5, b3 ends in doom because now the rook is doomed on b3. The bishop not only protects b2, but this rook gains time by attacking the bishop on h5. After bishop to g6 check, king e5, b4, white finds the very nice finish, king f6. If you take the rook, I take your bishop. I come to f7. I queen the pawn. You're not in time to defend against that. The bishop, even after ba3, ba3, rook c3, the bishop's protecting e3. So I'm going to queen anyway. Your rook's never going to get behind this pawn. So after bishop e8, rook d8, ba3, ba3, bishop d7, king f7, very precise. Now he's just threatening to take the bishop and then queen the pawn. Rook c3, rook takes d7. He can't go to e3, and he gave it, I think, he took the bishop. But if he would have gave a check here, we could simply play king e6, and then he can't give any more checks. The rook can't come to e3 because of the bishop. So he pretty much have to take the bishop anyway. He queens, then after rook f1, king g8, king b6, queen b8, black finally resigns. Amazing game, best game of the tournament so far. Both players put their cards all in. That's round 4 for you guys. So appreciate you tuning in. Just to check the standings one last time. Jan Nepomniachtchi tied for in the sole lead with 3 out of 4. Fabiano Caruana and Gukesh tied for second with 2.5 out of 4. And then there's literally the rest of the players are tied for 4th through 8th with 1.5 out of 4. So less than 50%. So they got to get on the ball and start to win some chess games. And we'll stay tuned for round 5, guys. Round 5 will be on Tuesday, and I will bring you the recap shortly after the round is finished. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget, give me a follow on Twitch. Subscribe to me on YouTube. This video will be posted on YouTube as well. I appreciate you guys tuning in. Good luck to you in your chess. Have a good night.